Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. You know, we're facing increasing and louder calls for the breakup of large internet service providers and social media platforms like Facebook and Google and even Amazon because of their outsized influence. But there is a precedent for this from 35 years ago that offers some lessons in what and how that might actually happen and whether indeed at all it should happen. And that is the breakup of what was once the most influential communications company probably on the planet, AT&T. And my guest today, Aaron Kershenbaum, a former professor at Brooklyn Polytechnic in New York, was the government's lead expert in that antitrust case 35 years ago. And he is here to tell us about his experience, the story of that case, and how that case paved the way for everything that we're talking about today. It's a great story, a fascinating episode, and he's a great guest. So stay tuned and enjoy. More and more, as major internet providers like Google and social media platforms like Facebook gain influence and are subject to criticism, increasing criticism, given the effect on everything from privacy to limiting content of speech and other major issues, so too are there increasing calls for the breakup of these major platforms and internet companies, even to the point of calls from some members of Congress and academics and critics that the antitrust laws should be brought to bear on these companies to break them into smaller pieces. My guest on today's episode is somebody who knows a lot about the breakup of major communications companies, Aaron Kershenbaum. Aaron, thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thanks for having me.
And for being in the studio, which is always a pleasure to have us be together in person. Aaron, you are the father of a friend of mine, right. Josh, and you happen to also have been one of the U.S. government's key expert witnesses 35 years ago in one of the most celebrated and arguably one of the most important antitrust cases in American history, the breakup of what was then called AT&T. So we're going to talk about what your role was in that case and how that experience leads us to understand how we are where we are today technologically with the rise of the internet and the rise of social media and the almost all-encompassing influence that they have today, and what we might understand about these calls for the breakup of these companies. So we're going to get into all of that today, but maybe you could start by giving us a little bit of your own background.
Sure.
And that will lead us into the story of how you got involved in the AT&T case 35 years ago.
I had the opportunity and the honor of getting into digital communications, computer communications, at pretty much the very beginning. I started working with a company called Network Analysis Corporation in 1969. And we helped to design the ARPANET, the Advanced Research Projects Agency of the Department of Defense, had a major research effort that it was funding in the area of computer communications. They were interested in that from the point of view of being able to coordinate the activities of the armed forces. And
that was really the precursor to what we today call the internet.
Absolutely. Yeah. The ARPANET was the first computer network where computers talked to one another, and there was something called distributed control, where there was no central control for the thing, but the computers exchange information from one another to make decisions about when to limit traffic coming into the network and how to route the traffic from one place to another. This was an area of active research at that time. the idea of being able to control a network without having a central place holding it together.
And what was your background? I mean, educationally and professionally, what were you doing for these companies?
I had, still do, have a PhD in electrical engineering, and my major was communications. And I got involved in computer communications pretty much at the very beginning. I worked with Network Analysis Corporation for about 8 years. We worked with AT&T, actually converting a lot of their facilities from analog to digital. I mean, before there was an internet, AT&T itself had to convert most of its, lots of its transmission facilities from analog to digital. They carried data under voice for a while, but that wasn't going to do the job. So the whole network was transformed. And the control structure, that is this distributed control structure, was implemented by AT&T putting in electronic switches that were smart enough to be able to sense how much traffic was and send it the right way. We have that now with things like Waze. Waze is doing just that sort of a thing. It's collecting information from cars, based on that making an assessment of where congestion is and routing cars around that. And it's a very interesting thing. It's not obvious that what they do. What they do is they don't send everybody to a faster route, because if they did, the route wouldn't be the faster route anymore. Right. They have to figure out how many cars roughly to send, and that's how the optimization is done. They also have to keep track of where there's accidents and stuff like that and make use of that. Well, that's exactly the same thing that's being done in the internet. And in the internet, of course, you're dealing with 1 billion nodes. So that's
lots more traffic.
Right. So the part of what you have to do is distribute the communication control. That is, you couldn't have a single computer doing that whole job. You would have to share it. And this brings back the central part of my testimony in the AT&T case. One of their big claims why they shouldn't be broken up is that the network couldn't be designed or managed after the network was broken up, that it had to be done in a centralized fashion. And
well, before we get into what your role was in the case, let's take a few steps back. Because I'm sure there are many people who probably have heard the name AT&T because it still exists today.
Right, that's right.
But don't really understand what AT&T was and the reach it had 35 years ago. I mean, I have children, 3 of my own and 3 stepchildren. They can't imagine a time before smartphones. If I say I had to dial a number, they don't even really know what that means because they've never actually dialed a number on a dial on a phone, on a telephone. So take us back, and we'll get into the story of what you brought to what ultimately was the successful breakup of that monster company. But take us back 35 years ago and tell us a little bit about what AT&T was and the world we lived in technologically in terms of communications at that time.
It did indeed have ownership of pretty much all, I won't say all, that's not fair. There were 1,700 telephone companies at that time, but they all used AT&T facilities to connect to one another. There were mom and pop telephone companies that had only a very limited geographic reach, but AT&T was the binding force on all of that, and they controlled everything that was happening there. In particular, they controlled the new technology that was coming in. Most of it was coming from Bell Laboratories.
Which was owned by AT&T.
Correct. Yeah. And Western Electric, which was their manufacturing arm. And so other companies that wanted to introduce new types of equipment, most notably wireless equipment, were squelched. by that. Not to mention the fact that AT&T had way more capital than any of these other companies. And so they were in control of what was going on. They were in control of the content as well. Now, today, there's all kinds of content, digital video and voice. Voice was there, but images and
podcast content.
Podcast content, that's right.
Yeah.
A very big thing was that because they were a regulated monopoly by the government, as they had the rights to essentially allow or not allow other companies on, in exchange for that, they had to meet certain standards because they were a common carrier. And because they were a common carrier, you had a legal responsibility to the public. You, for instance, couldn't, just because some guy was a hermit and lived on the top of a mountain, you couldn't say you would have given him service. It was a requirement that they provide universal service. And that's not true anymore. The ISPs, that is the Internet Service Providers, are much less regulated. AT&T had to meet what was called a grade of service. That is that when you picked up your line, your phone, that there would be a dial tone like 99% of the time. At that time, you were given, when you made a telephone call, they dedicated capacity to you so that you didn't have to deal, as we do today, with a call breaking down or with the quality of the call breaking down. And so they had an obligation in addition to having a monopoly. That's no longer true.
Okay. So, and I know I'm asking you to boil down some history and some concepts that are enormously complex.
Sure.
But in a fairly boiled down way, what was the case against AT&T? What was the case for breaking up that huge company?
I guess I'm not a lawyer, but I guess it's something along the lines of restraint of trade. That is, that what they were doing was preventing other companies from effectively competing with them by putting all sorts of restrictions on the other companies. Now, in fairness to AT&T, some of that is legitimate. If people, it was a physical network, electrically based. If people were to connect devices to it that would damage the switches or damage the lines, that would be terrible. And so having some standards and restrictions certainly made sense. But the feeling was that a lot of what AT&T was doing was preventing other companies from bringing in new technology and bringing in new types of traffic onto the network. And after the divestiture, that was definitely proved to be right.
Right.
The internet today is carrying all kinds of traffic that you never would have seen before the divestiture.
And as we'll talk about in a little while, that traffic and the growth of the internet and companies that have taken advantage of the growth of the internet, like Facebook and Twitter and others, may not have existed today.
Right.
Maybe someday they would exist, but they arguably wouldn't have existed today without the breakup of AT&T.
Right.
And I am a lawyer. I'm not an antitrust lawyer. Right. So I'm not. I can't, hold myself out as an expert in all aspects of the AT&T breakup from an antitrust perspective. But generally, we do think about the effect of a company that has so much reach and so much power and so much control over a sector of the economy that it leads to anti-competitive behavior, and that can mean impact on price, that they have the ability to control price and therefore their revenues and profits. But also, and you mentioned this, another potential consequence of anti-competitive control by a company is the ways in which that can impede technological advancement and innovation. And as you mentioned, we have seen that since the breakup. So how did you then? How did you become involved in the case, and what We've already mentioned that you served as an expert witness, that you testified for the government against AT&T and in favor of breaking up in AT&T. Tell us a little bit about your story in that case.
Well, one of the things is that I was a professor at the time. I didn't own the company. And
where were you teaching?
At Brooklyn Polytechnic, in the Electrical Engineering and Computer Science department. There were other people who were asked to do what I did, but they were in a position where they were afraid to do it because AT&T had so much power. Whereas I was, in a sense, a free agent.
Because you were in academia?
Because I was in academia.
Yeah.
I had worked with many, many companies, and so I had firsthand experience on that. I worked with AT&T as a consultant. I worked with IBM. I worked with the government on a lot of its government networks. For instance, the network in the Supreme Court I worked on.
Oh, wow.
It was, not a national network, but it was definitely carrying
So the justices could communicate with each other.
That's right. And that, by the way, to some extent, interested them in having me work along with them, because I had been working with the Department of Justice. There was not a big job, but nevertheless, and so that was...
Well, I remember, this is going way back, not quite as far back as the AT&T case, but I remember in the early days of my career as a journalist, before I went to law school, our newsroom was outfitted with a local area network, a LAN, and I remember thinking, God, that is wild how sophisticated that is, that we can communicate. That I can send an article to my editor from right inside the same office, and that's an early expression of a network.
Right.
But the AT&T network that we're talking about was not local and was not within companies, but was nationwide.
Right.
So what? Okay, so you had the freedom to come in as an expert witness because of where you worked at the time, and what was the, in summary, what was the opinion that you were brought in to offer in support of the breakup?
That is that it was possible to operate the network, to design it, to add capacity to it, to manage it on a moment-by-moment basis, even though multiple organizations were involved in it. And the reason for this is what I had started to mention before. The network physically was using distributed control. It wasn't that there was one place that decided how all the traffic should go. It wasn't one place that said, oh, this traffic can come in and this traffic can't. This is just voice lines. They would give busy circuits if, in fact, there was more traffic than the network could handle at that moment. But that was done on a local basis. The AT&T network was a 5-level hierarchy. So there were local parts that routed traffic just in the local parts. And then they glued together to the next level and to the next level. And that's how the network operated. That's how it was planned. That's how it was designed. And so that was an inherently distributed process. The substance of my testimony was that, given that breaking up the network would not actually damage the way it was going to be managed.
And what was AT&T saying? That if you break us up, the network, and they're referring to network and the way network was understood 35 years ago, a hardwired network of lines.
That's right.
Controlled by sophisticated distributing equipment and routing equipment and so on, that if we break up our network, our hardline network, the whole system is going to fall apart.
Correct. Correct. And there was another thing, and that's from the point of view of the economics.
Yeah.
If there's one company, then you say, well, it's operating for the good of the entire network. But the real truth is that was so big that the individual operating companies essentially were given control over their parts of the network.
Right.
It's good management to actually distribute control of the network, because the top is not really capable of dealing with all of the day-to-day stuff, and any company that large gives control over to levels below. Of course, those people have to report back up, but all the day-to-day decisions are made in a distributed fashion.
And in the way the network was constructed, as you've explained, it was set up in a decentralized way. And, and in fact, when the government brought, in no small part because of the testimony that you offered, which the court accepted and found compelling. Technologically, it was found very feasible to break up that network. And in fact, the network was broken up, and it was broken up into what we then called the regional bells, the regional telephone companies. And that was the initial consequence of the breakup, right?
Yep.
So, okay, so what does now? What do you do now? How are you keeping in touch with? Because we're going to get into this now. We want to relate that experience and some of the lessons that you learned from that to where we are today. How? Tell us what the rest of your career was and how you have maintained some knowledge and expertise in this area.
The underlying principles of network design carry over into many different types of networks. I, for many years, did consulting for companies, large companies, and the government on how to design and manage networks. One of the things that happened, though, it's sort of a victim of my own success, is that when the internet came into being and really got established, network design was really nothing more, well, I won't say nothing more, but largely just using facilities on the internet. And because the control was so distributed there, individual organizations would, in fact, just plan their individual use, and the kind of stuff that I was doing wasn't as necessary as it had been before. However, I continued to do research. I continued to see what basic principles of network design were being used and followed and what ones weren't. And today, there are several real concerns. One is that a lot of the biggest carriers, let me just call players like Facebook, Google, Amazon, are sources of content, as well as having a major role in the actual network itself. And in that regard, that can be very, well, I won't say destructive, but you're in a position to, in effect, exercise what would be a monopoly, because you're controlling the content and, in many cases, controlling the communication. And the more these guys mesh together, the bigger this problem actually is. And my worry is that because these large organizations, unlike AT&T, not being common carriers, they have no obligation to the public. They could, in effect, rape the network, basically, take out as much as they could from it without putting back, and that will be a disaster.
Well, help me understand what that means. So let's take Amazon as an example. I mean, the content part, I think most of us have been on Amazon to shop or been into a supermarket, or some of us have been on Amazon a lot. For those reasons. But so we understand the content, that you can go there and find something to buy. How does a company like Amazon influence the network itself?
Okay, they become a source for a tremendous amount of data on the network, right? Millions and millions of people are going to Amazon to buy things. And Amazon is sending back pages with lots of bits in them. There's pictures and stuff, and you could scroll through hundreds and hundreds of items. That's putting a load on the network. And if somebody isn't actually channeling back resources to put more capacity in the network, what's going to happen is the network will get overloaded. And at that point, the quality of service will go down.
I see.
And at that point, people will stop relying on the network, and it'll collapse.
Okay, so that raises a different question then. When we were talking about AT&T and phone lines, we're talking about hard lines.
That's right.
In the early days of the network, we were still talking about hard lines, although we had cable to the
that
vehicle
counts too.
for transmitting.
Right. That counts also as a hard line.
Right, that's a hard line. Right. And then we have the advent of wireless.
Correct.
Transmission of voice and data.
Right.
I read, I think it was this morning, that SpaceX, which I think is Elon Musk's company, and another company, are looking to launch what was described as a constellation of satellites that could serve as direct sources of transmission from space. And that the service in terms of data speed may not be what it is on land-based transmission equipment, but particularly for those in rural areas and hard to reach areas, something would be better than nothing, and that would definitely increase access to the internet. The theory goes, and we'll see how successful they are. But is that what we're talking about when we talk about the network? Because I think a lot of people, again, think about I know I say this all the time. When my internet goes slow, I'm yelling at my phone, I'm yelling at my computer, and then I have to stop myself and say, it's actually a miracle that it works at all.
Sure.
And I don't even understand how it works. So what does it mean that the system, when you say the system could collapse, and what do you see from your experience with AT&T and the other work that you've done in computer networking? What needs to be addressed that you're concerned these big companies are not addressing?
Correct. And we get back to, well, let me try to answer it in a direct sort of a way. The network doesn't have to handle all the traffic in the same way. The problem, and you could see it even without a network, if you had a room with 100 people in it and people were talking to one another, it was like a party or a get-together, if too many people are talking at the same time, no one is heard. And in the wireless portion of the internet, that could very well be what's going on. It's a disaster because the way the protocol is set up, if you send a message and you don't get an acknowledgement, you send the message again. The more collisions there are, the more messages are going to be sent again, and eventually reach a point where nothing is getting through.
Well, I'll offer another example from what I'm sure is a lot of people's experience. If you go to a stadium for a football game, let's say, stadium holds 60, 70, 80,000 people or more, or see a concert in a big stadium. I think we've all had this experience that your phone may not send a message inside the stadium that 2 blocks away it will send very, very easily. And that sounds like an analogy to what you were saying before about a room that is too full of people talking at the same time.
And it is possible through intelligent design and an investment to fix that. Because you can put essentially cellular receivers in many places that will pick up the traffic from a relatively small number of people that are close to it. It will be able to serve those people. Those receivers would be tied together by fiber, and at that point the problem would go away. But someone has to invest in putting in those small receivers. That's an answer to the problem. And it's a legitimate answer, and I believe from an economic point of view it's feasible. You're simply saying that I have to make the investment so that the quality of service will be acceptable. Doesn't have to be great. I mean, when you talk about voice, you just have to be able to understand that the other person is there. You have to be able to maintain the call.
Well, let me ask you this, and this may be too personal a question, but again, I'm sure that
I'm from Brooklyn.
I mean, personal for me. This is like something that I really need an answer to from my own experience. But I have to believe lots of people have had that experience. I pretty much take the same commute home every day. I drive the same route. And if I'm on a phone call, when I start my drive, I know exactly the spot where I'm going to drop that call.
Right.
It happens almost with precision.
Sure.
In a certain 2 or 3 block area.
Right.
Why does that happen?
It happens
because I think that gets to the problem of over or of lack of capacity in the network. But I'm not sure I understand why it happens.
The actual answer there is that in order for any communication to take place, you need, in some sense, line of sight. And if you're in a place, let me take a graphic example. If you're in a valley between 2 mountains, then unless there are transmitters that'll get you up to the top of the mountain, you can't get out of the valley. And if you're in a particular place where there are other massive things, could be buildings, could be hills, that are interfering with the signal, you lose it.
But that problem could be fixed, just like the problem with the stadium crowd could be fixed if you added more hardware, more transmitters.
That's right,
and to get around those.
And it is starting to be these G5 network that's being launched is doing stuff like that.
Okay.
So it's not that it's a completely bleak picture.
Okay.
So that is actually starting to be done.
Well, let's bring it back then to these large companies that everybody is focused on, and you've mentioned. Let's stay with Amazon as a company that we can use to illustrate here.
Right.
What specifically is your concern that they are so large and so dominating in their field, in their part of the network?
Right.
Their use of capacity is enormous, and I think you said, but they're not putting back capital to invest in increasing capacity. What exactly does that mean? Not putting in more cell towers? I mean, is that something Amazon should be doing?
Yes.
And why?
Well, because they should be basically carrying their load. They shouldn't be dumping their load onto the rest of the network. Now, there's nothing that says that Amazon has to be directly forced to do that. In fact, one of the things which goes back to AT&T is that AT&T would charge less if you made a telephone call at night than if you made it during the day. Why? Because at night they weren't carrying as much traffic, and so they could provide better service to you. And more important, if they got your traffic off of the network during the day, everybody else would get better service. So this is mutually beneficial. That is, everybody comes out better. And what the idea then is that if you're offering a lower rate to a large customer to get him off from the peak period, everybody benefits. And so now this notion of net neutrality is still a very real thing.
Explain that.
Net neutrality is supposed to be that the big guys can't keep the little guys out. They can't bump them to the side by taking a higher priority.
Based on content?
Well, it's not directly based on content. It has to do with what the big guys are transmitting and what the little guys are transmitting. If you have a small political organization trying to get someone elected locally, and so they make use of the network. They have a website. They have Facebook site. If they couldn't actually access their thing, they're being sort of kept away from the value that the network could add to their stuff.
In other words, to go back to the example you gave where traffic may be lighter in the evening than during the daytime, an internet service provider can't say, well, this little guy, we'll give them access at night.
That's right.
They have to have free access.
That's right. And it's interesting, too, because one of the things that AT&T did was they gave lower rates to big customers, but they gave it to them, they gave it to them at times where they weren't interfering with other people. Today, we think in terms of people carrying cell phones and talking to one another in real time. Large organizations transfer a massive amount of data, say inventory, Ford Motor Company, GM, transfer their inventory from one place to another so that they can manage the inventory. That can be done at night. And so that traffic is taken off the load during the day. They're perfectly happy because they don't need to actually have it there at 2:30 in the afternoon.
Right.
And so by managing the network properly, everyone can benefit.
I'm thinking of another analogy when we talk about traffic. Our highways is a kind of network.
That's right.
And I don't think anybody who has been on the highway at night is unaware of the fact that you're going to see a lot more trucks on the highway.
That's right.
Or it feels that way anyway.
That's right.
At night because there's less traffic. I assume there's lowered risk of liability for a truck on a highway at night in some sense because they're not competing on the roadway with as many cars.
Yep.
So from a regulatory standpoint, when we talk about, and some people are talking about more and more, looking into the benefits of breaking up a company like Amazon or Facebook or Google, are there less drastic steps that could be taken to improve access, to improve the quality of service?
Absolutely.
And what?
If in fact more regulation was taking place. So, for instance, one of the things that AT&T had to adhere to was they had to guarantee a quality of service.
Right.
The idea being that if you picked up your telephone receiver, that less than 1% of the time would you get a busy circuit. Of course, you get a busy signal if the guy you're calling is on the phone.
Yeah.
But less than 1% of the time would you get a busy circuit.
Well,
they had to engineer the network in that sort of a way.
Well, doesn't the free market to some extent take care of that? I mean, we see cell phone companies bragging, well, let's just say advertising.
Right.
We have the lowest drop call rate, or we have only 72% whatever. They're advertising their capacity, their capabilities technologically in terms of quality of service. And why isn't that good
We're
enough?
back to where we were 35 years ago. If you're a small company, you're using cell phone towers that the big companies have. You can, if you're a little company, you can't afford to put cell phone towers all over the United States. You're going to have to make use of cell phone towers from the other guys. And now you're back to this restraint of trade. If the other guys don't give you access to their network, then...
So who owns those? Who owns the cell towers that we see all over?
Many of them are owned by the big internet service providers. And another thing too, the FCC gives out frequencies. All of these wireless transmissions have to be either in different frequency bands, or you can have code division multiplexing. But the thing is that somebody it's not owns in the sense of dollars and cents, but they've given authorization from the FCC to use various frequencies. A little guy may not have access to enough frequency, almost certainly won't have enough access to enough frequency to be able to provide service all over the place. A cell phone tower has a range maybe of 2 miles. Well, if you're talking about having someone make a telephone call that'll end up 3,000 miles away,
You have to go through a lot of towers.
You got to go through a lot of towers. Now, if the regulations are such that doesn't prevent people from using other people's towers, that is, it's an open thing. Again, it's perfectly reasonable that if a small company is using a big company's towers, you have to pay for it. But he shouldn't be restricted from using it altogether.
Could the government get involved in building towers to improve access?
It could.
Why does this necessarily have to come, do you think, from those companies that because they were well managed or they had a great idea, like Facebook was such a great idea for the right time, and they've become hugely successful and hugely profitable? Why should we think in terms of their being obligated to take care of that? I know that you made the point earlier that because they're using so much capacity through their network.
So it's the concept of right-of-way. AT&T's monopoly, more than anything else, came from the fact that it had right-of-way. That they had the legal right to put telephone poles all along the way. So here, there's a notion of right-of-way. That is, if a large carrier has essentially control over various frequencies, then they have that right-of-way, and a small carrier doesn't. By the way, all of this, we talk about it from the point of view of money, but there are much more serious things. I was in Brooklyn, at Brooklyn Poly, for many years, and we got involved with the city looking at wireless networks that were being used by the police department and the fire department and the ambulances, and they didn't have access to enough frequencies to do their job. The FCC had granted all of these frequencies, not all of them, but too many of them, to large carriers to broadcast music and to do all the stuff that a big company does. And the public, this was life and death. If the ambulances and the police cars couldn't get to where they were going, that was a serious business. So that's where the government could get in. Doesn't have to take over the actual construction of the stuff, but could regulate it for the public good. Doesn't have to over-regulate it either. There's nothing that says this notion, again, of net neutrality. You want to make sure that everybody has a chance. It's not necessary that everybody have exactly the same chance. One of the basic things in networks is economy of scale. What do you have a network in the first place for? People share capacity. Why they share capacity? Because it's more efficient to do that. You get a better utilization. When you go into a supermarket, right? Each person joins a separate line. So if one line, the clerk's not doing anything and you're standing on the line for another clerk, you would be waiting when you didn't have to wait. Now, of course, what's the answer to that? People look, and if they see that the other clerk is not busy, then they'll go over to the other line. Also, the clerk himself will.
But if there's only one line, you're going to wait. So an answer to that is open more lines.
It's interesting.
We've all been in that situation.
It's interesting because if, in fact, the one line is being served by many servers, and when any server gets free, it'll take somebody off of that big long line, you could actually get better service that way. Another thing too is that there is some mathematics in it, is that, but just looking in a supermarket, you'll see they have lines for people with only a few items.
Right.
And they'll let those people have their own line. And the reason for that is that if you look at the good of the all, everybody is better off like that.
Very interesting. So that's a great analogy. So it's interesting that it seems today when people talk about these companies are too big, we've got to break up Facebook, they're not really at least what I've heard, they're not really focused on the issues that you're highlighting. There seem to be much more, it's almost like breaking up Facebook, to switch to that example, is punitive.
Right.
That's right. They were vulnerable to Russian bots. They control and regulate their content. There are issues with privacy breaches, and this is terrible, terrible, terrible. We don't like this. Break them up. And that seems much more problematic from a legal standpoint than the issues you're talking about, which is the extent to which these large companies, social media platforms, internet service providers, and so on, are taxing the system.
Right.
Ultimately, we should worry to the detriment of everybody.
That's right.
Without putting enough back into the system. So that seems like something that could be handled through even limited regulatory schemes, rather than the more drastic approach that some people are talking about.
Right. And I believe I'm arguing based on engineering principles, not based on political principles.
Are you available to the administration or Congress if they'd like to call upon you for your experiences?
Absolutely.
I think this is really fascinating to understand better how what we have works the way it does, and some of the roots of that you were very important part of in that AT&T case. It's I'm almost 57, so 35 years ago. I do remember that, but for many people today, that's a very long time ago. But the roots of the issues we're talking about today are definitely found in that experience you had then.
Absolutely.
So interesting. Aaron Kershenbaum, thank you so much for coming into the studio. Thank you for sharing your story and your experience and your perspective on this, and for answering my question about why my calls are dropping, because I always shake my fist at that point. And I'm sure there have to be a lot of people at some point in their day doing the same thing. So thank you for all of that. It was great to have you.
Thank you. It was great being here.